Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young and the stars were closer to men as hearts. I have walked through countless winters, my dear friend, and I have felt the bite of frost in places you might never imagine. But tonight, I wish to carry you back to an age when cold was not merely an inconvenience to be dismissed with the turn of a dial, but a living adversary that stalked the halls of even the mightiest fortresses. Picture, if you will, a castle rising from the frozen earth like a crown of stone and shadow. Its walls are thick 10 feet deep, in places built not for comfort, but for war. The very architecture that keeps enemies at bay also traps the winter's chill within, turning these grand halls into what I have come to call refrigerators made of rock. The stone absorbs the cold like a sponge drinks water, and then radiates it inward, breath by breath, hour by hour, until even the air itself feels heavy with ice. I recall standing in such a fortress once, in the northern reaches of what you now call England, during a winter so fierce that even the hardened men-at-arms spoke in hushed whispers of its cruelty. The wind did not merely blow, it howled, finding every crack in the mortar, every gap between shutters, every arrow slit designed to rain death upon invaders. Through these openings, the cold crept in like an invisible army, relentless and patient. Within these walls lived knightsmen of iron and oath, warriors who faced swords and lances without flinching. Yet, when night fell and the temperature plummeted, even these champions of the realm found themselves locked in a different kind of battle. This was not a contest of strength or skill, but of survival itself. How does one sleep when the very walls seem to conspire with winter? How does one rest when breath turns to mist and frost creeps along the inside of shutters like fingers of ice reaching inward? The answer, I have learned, lies not in a single solution, but in a tapestry woven from privilege, labor, ritual, and sheer human determination. Every element of a knight's nightly preparation was a deliberate act of defiance against the colder refusal to surrender to the darkness and the frost. Let me guide you through one such night, step by careful step, as a knight of noble birth prepares to face the coldest hours. We shall begin, not in the bedchamber itself, but in understanding the very nature of the fortress that surrounds him. The castle, you must understand, was never designed for human comfort. Its purpose was singular and absolute: to withstand siege, to repel attackers, to stand firm when all else crumbled. The thick stone walls that seemed so formidable from without became prisons of cold from within. I remember the great hall of one such castle, a vast chamber with a ceiling that soared upward into shadow. During the day, it was filled with the sounds of life, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the bark of hounds. But as night descended and the household dispersed, the hall transformed. The fire in the central hearth, which had blazed so bravely during supper, now seemed pitifully small against the enormity of space. Heat rose upward, lost itself in the vaulted ceiling, and vanished like prayer into an indifferent sky. The knights and nobles of the household did not sleep in this hall, though lesser servants might huddle near the dying embers for what warmth they could steal. No, those of higher rank retreated to private chambers, the solar, as it was called, or rooms tucked into towers and upper floors. These chambers were a matter of careful calculation. A room too high in a tower caught the full fury of the wind, its walls trembling with each gust, A room too low gathered the dampness that seeped up from the earth below. The ideal chamber was one that captured what little rising warmth the great hall provided while remaining sheltered from the worst of the exterior elements. Wealthier households moved their sleeping quarters seasonally like migratory birds following the sun. In the depths of winter, they might abandon the tower rooms entirely, instead claiming chambers adjacent to the kitchens, where ovens burned day and night. The heat from bread baking and roasting meat became a precious resource, more valuable than gold in those frozen months. But even the best-positioned chamber was still a cold place. The stone walls wept with condensation. Drafts found their way through invisible cracks. The floor, whether bare stone or covered with rushes, transmitted cold upward through the soles of one's feet like a slow poison. To combat this, the household employed what defenses it could muster. Tapestries hung along the walls, not merely for decoration, though they were often beautiful, depicting scenes of hunts or biblical tales. These thick, woven hangings served as the first barrier against the drafts, muting the whistle of wind through mortar joints, creating a dead air space between fabric and stone that slowed, however slightly, the inexorable creep of cold. Windows were another challenge entirely. Only the wealthiest castles possessed glass, and even then, it was rare and precious, reserved for the chapel or the Lord's own chamber. Most windows were simply openings in the stone, covered by wooden shutters that could be barred from within. On the coldest nights, these shutters were sealed tight, but they were never perfect. The wood warped with moisture, gaps appeared, and through these gaps the wind sang its bitter song. Some households stretched oiled cloth or scraped parchment across the window openings, translucent enough to admit a sickly light during the day, opaque enough to block some portion of the wind. But these were fragile barriers, and they rattled and flapped in the gales, creating a soundscape that made sleep difficult even for the exhausted. I recall one particular tower room where the lady of the castle had ordered servants to stuff every visible crack with wadded cloth and moss. The chamber looked as though it had been bandaged, wrapped in makeshift bindings, like a wounded soldier. And yet still, on the coldest nights, you could feel the air moving, could watch your breath cloud and drift toward some unseen exit. This, then, was the arena in which the nightly battle was fought, not a welcoming refuge, but a contested space that required constant effort to maintain. The castle itself was neutral at best, hostile at worst. Survival required transforming a corner of this stone fortress into something resembling Sheltora microclimate, carved out through determination and resources. And so, as the sun began its descent, and the household prepared for the long night ahead, the true work began. Chapter 3. The servants' invisible labor, long before a knight even contemplated sleep. An army of unseen hands labored to make rest possible. I have always marveled at this, how the comfort of the powerful rested upon the invisible toil of the powerless. Let me draw back the curtain and show you what unfolded in the hours before a knight's head touched his pillow. The preparation of a chamber for sleep was a ritual as complex as arming for battle, and it required similar precision. In the wealthiest households, this task might fall to half a dozen servants, each with their own responsibilities. In more modest establishments, a single page or squire might struggle to complete the work alone, racing against the falling darkness. First came the fire. A knight's chamber, if he was fortunate enough to have one, would contain a fireplace built into the thickness of the wall. These were marvels of engineering, massive stone constructions with chimneys that rose up through the floors above, carrying smoke away from the living spaces. But they were also temperamental beasts that required constant feeding and attention. The servant responsible for the fire would begin his work while afternoon light still lingered. He would clear away the previous night's ashes, though not entirely. A bed of ash served to insulate and preserve coals. Upon this foundation, he would build a careful architecture of kindling and logs, positioning them to catch the draft just so. The wood itself was a precious commodity, cut and split and dried over months. In regions where forests grew scarce, fuel became a source of anxiety. I have heard of households that rationed firewood as carefully as they rationed grain during sieges. Once lit, the fire required vigilance. Too much wood, and the room filled with smoke, choking the inhabitants. Too little, and the fire died, leaving the chamber to freeze. The art lay in finding the balance, steady, modest blaze that provided localized warmth without consuming excessive fuel or fouling the air. But the fireplace alone was insufficient. Its heat radiated outward in a narrow cone, warming one side of the room while leaving the rest in icy shadow. To address this limitation, servants employed portable braziers, iron or bronze bowls mounted on legs or equipped with handles. These were filled with glowing coals, drawn from the main fire and positioned strategically around the chamber. I must tell you, though, that braziers were as dangerous as they were useful. In an enclosed space with poor ventilation, they consumed the oxygen in the air and produced invisible, odorless fumes that could render a sleeper unconscious or worse. I have heard whispered accounts of entire families found dead in their beds, victims of what we now understand to be carbon monoxide poisoning. They called it bad air in those days, a miasma that crept in through the night. Some believed it was carried by demons or evil spirits. In truth, it was their own heating devices turning against them. To combat both the cold and the danger of fumes, servants sometimes added herbs to the coals: lavender, rosemary, dried rose petals. These perfumed the smoke, masking the harsh smell of burning charcoal, while also, it was believed, purifying the air. Whether this practice had any real protective effect, I cannot say with certainty, but the psychological comfort it provided was undeniable. To fall asleep, surrounded by the scent of summer gardens, while winter raged outside, was its own small victory. While one servant tended the fires, another prepared the floor. The stone underfoot was mercilessly cold, and so the medieval household covered it with rushes long, green reeds cut from riverbanks and marshes. These were strewn across the floor in thick layers, sometimes mixed with dried herbs and flowers. Fresh rushes gave off a pleasant, meadow-like scent. They also provided a thin layer of insulation, trapping air between the stems and softening the hardness of stone. But rushes had their drawbacks. They attracted vermin, mice, fleas, and other unwelcome guests. They became damp with spilled liquids and tracked in mud, growing foul over time. In well-managed households, the rushes were replaced weekly or even more frequently. In less diligent homes, they might linger for months, compacting into a fetid mat that harbored all manner of unpleasantness. On this particular night, the rushes in our knight's chamber were fresh, scattered just that afternoon. The servant responsible had mixed them with chamomile and mint, herbs believed to encourage peaceful sleep and ward off evil humors. The scent rose gently as he walked across the floor, preparing the final and most crucial element of the room, the bed itself. Ah, the bed. This was not a simple matter of pulling back a cover and fluffing a pillow. The medieval bed was a complex construction that required expert preparation to transform it from a cold, inhospitable platform into something resembling comfort. The bed frame stood tall, often 3 feet or more above the floor. This height was not for grandeur alone, though it certainly conveyed status. Crucially, it lifted the sleeper above the coldest layer of air, which settled near the ground like invisible water filling a basin. The frame was sturdy, built from oak or other hardwoods, its joints reinforced with iron brackets. Across this frame were stretched ropes-thick cords that needed periodic tightening to maintain their tension. Hence the old phrase, still remembered in your time, sleep tight. It was literal advice. Upon the ropes rested the mattress. For a night of means, this might be a feather tika, large fabric envelope, stuffed with goose or duck down. These were luxury items, soft and warm, offering insulation that straw could never match. They appeared in household inventories, alongside jewels and silver plate. They were inherited, treasured, and carefully maintained. But even a feather mattress could not work its magic without preparation. During the day, the bedding absorbed moisture from the air, the same condensation that wept down the stone walls. Left untreated, this dampness would seep into the sleeper-esque clothes and chill him to the bone faster than any draft. The solution was to warm and dry the bed before use. For this task, the servant employed a warming, panna-covered metal vessel with a long wooden handle. He filled it with glowing coals from the fire, then carefully slid it between the sheets, moving it back and forth in slow, methodical sweeps. The heat drove out the dampness, left the fabric warm to the touch, and created a small pocket of comfort in an otherwise frigid chamber. This was delicate work. Press too long in one spot, and the sheets might scorch or even catch fire. Move too quickly, and the dampness remained. The servant needed to develop an instinct for it, a feel for the precise balance of heat and time. I have watched many perform this task over the centuries, and the skilled ones moved with a kind of meditative grace, their attention wholly absorbed in the simple act of making a bed habitable. While the warming pan did its work, another servant might prepare hot stones or bricks, heating them in the fire until they glowed with stored warmth. These were wrapped in cloth, usually old wool or linen, to worn for other purposes, and placed at the foot of the bed. Throughout the night, they would radiate heat, warming the sleeper's feet and creating a gradient of temperature beneath the covers. Finally, with the mattress warmed and the stones in place, the servants layered the bedding itself. First came a linen sheet, smooth against the skin and easier to launder than the outer layers. Over this went wool blankets thick, heavy weaves that trapped heat, and finally, crowning the whole construction, came the pelts, sheepskins, bearskins, wolf furs, deerskins. These were the ultimate barrier against cold, their natural oils repelling moisture, their dense fur creating layers of trapped air. The number and quality of these pelts varied dramatically with rank and wealth. A lord might sleep under 6 or 8 layers of fur, each skin carefully tanned and stitched together. A lesser knight might make do with 2 or 3, but even a single pelt could make the difference between tolerable discomfort and unbearable suffering. Around the bed frame hung the final defense, curtains. These were not decorative flourishes, but essential equipment for survival. Made from heavy wool, sometimes lined with linen or even waxed cloth. They hung from rods or cords attached to the bedposts. When drawn closed, they transformed the bed into a small, enclosed space, a tent within the room, a cave within the castle. The servant pulled these curtains now, checking that they overlapped properly, that no gaps remained for drafts to penetrate. He tied them secure with cords, creating a seal. Within this fabric cocoon, the night's own body heat and breath would accumulate, raising the temperature by precious degrees. It was the final layer of defense, the innermost wall of a fortress within a fortress. Only when all this was complete, the fires lit, the braziers positioned, the rushes scattered, the bed warmed and dressed, the servant withdraw, leaving the chamber ready for its occupant. The work had taken perhaps an hour, maybe more, and represented a significant expenditure of labor and resources. Yet this was performed night after night throughout the winter. In every chamber of the castle where someone of sufficient rank slept. I have often reflected on this invisible architecture of comfort, how the rest of the powerful was built upon the exhaustion of the many. The knight would enter his prepared chamber, appreciating, perhaps, the warmth of the fire or the scent of herbs, but likely taking for granted the hours of work that made his sleep possible. Such is the nature of privilege. It renders its own foundations invisible, and yet I cannot bring myself to condemn this system entirely, for it was also a form of mutual survival. The servants who labored to warm their master's chamber were themselves warmer for working near the fires. The household that maintained its lord also maintained itself. In the harsh calculus of medieval winter, everyone played their role in a collective effort to outlast the cold. The chamber was ready now, waiting in the darkness, and as the last light faded from the western sky, the knight himself approached, ready to begin his own preparations for the long night ahead. Chapter 4. The Ritual of Disrobing. The knight paused at the threshold of his chamber, the warmth from within beckoning like a promise. But before he could claim that warmth, before he could sink into the prepared bed, he faced a ritual that was both relief and vulnerability, the removal of his armor. I have seen this scene countless times, in countless variations, and yet it never ceases to move me. The transformation of warrior into man, the shedding of an iron skin to reveal the flesh beneath. For armor, you must understand, was not merely protective equipment. It was a second body, worn from dawn until dusk, shaping not just the knight's appearance, but his very posture, his movement, his sense of self. A full suit of plate armor could weigh 50 pounds or more. Chainmail alone, that intricate weave of iron rings, might tip the scales at 30 pounds. Add to this the gambeson worn beneath for padding, the greaves for the legs, the gauntlets for the hands, the helmet that transformed a man's head into a faceless sphere of metal. The total weight was not merely physical, but existential. One did not simply wear armor. One inhabited it, lived within it, became partially defined by it. Throughout the day, this weight pressed constantly downward on the shoulders, across the back, around the neck. It compressed the spine, strained the hips, turned simple movements into calculated efforts. Standing in full armor required strength. Walking demanded balance. Mounting a horse became an exercise in controlled momentum. By day's end, even the most hardened knight felt the accumulated toll of bearing this burden. And so the nightly removal of armor was not simply practical, it was transformative. I remember watching one particular knight, a grizzled veteran of the French campaigns, as his squire began the process of disarming him. The knight stood in the center of his chamber, still as a statue, while the boy worked through the sequence with practiced efficiency. First came the helmet, lifted carefully from the head. The knight's hair, matted with sweat despite the cold, clung to his scalp. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, savoring the simple luxury of unrestricted breath, of hearing without the metallic echo that armored warriors live within. His face bore the imprint of the helmet's padding red lines across his forehead, indentations at his temples. Next, the gauntlets were peeled away, freeing hands that had been encased in articulated steel for 12 hours or more. The knight flexed his fingers, wincing slightly at the stiffness in his joints. Without the weight of metal gloves, his hands felt almost weightless, capable of sudden, delicate movements. The pauldrons came off those curved plates, protecting the shoulders, and immediately the knight's posture shifted. His shoulders dropped, no longer braced against the weight. He rolled them backward, forward, seeking relief from the constant tension. Piece by piece, the armor was stripped away. The breastplate, with its carefully hammered curves designed to deflect blows, was lifted over the head. The backplate, requiring the squire to reach around and work the leather straps. The falds, protecting the waist and hips. The cuisses on the thighs. The greaves on the shins. Each removal was a small liberation, a reclaiming of natural movement. Finally came the mail shirtha hauberkif the knight wore, one beneath his plate. This required particular care. The servant gathered the bottom hem and began working it upward, bunching the thousands of interlocked rings as he went. The knight raised his arms, and together they wrestled the mail over his head and arms. It emerged inside out, a heavy serpent skin of iron, and was laid aside with a sound like coins pouring into a chest. Beneath the mail was the gambasuna padded jacket of quilted linen or wool. This, too, was removed, though many knights chose to keep it on as a layer of warmth. The padding trapped body heat effectively, and on the coldest nights, a knight might sleep in his gambeson, accepting the lingering smell of sweat in exchange for insulation. Standing now in just his undertunic and hose, the knight experienced what I can only describe as euphoria. The sensation of lightness was almost dizzying. He felt as though he might float upward, freed from the gravitational anchor of iron. Every movement was suddenly effortless, raising an arm, turning his head, bending at the waist. It was as though he had been reborn into a body made of air. But this lightness brought its own vulnerability. The armor had been protection, yes, but also a kind of psychological armor, encased in steel. A knight was invincible, or could believe himself so. Stripped bare, he became acutely aware of his own fragility. The cold, which the armor had partially blocked, now touched him directly. He was mortal again, subject to the same frailties as any man. Some knights, I have observed, struggled with this transition. They kept their swords close at hand, even in the bedchamber, unable to fully surrender the warrior identity. One lord I knew insisted on sleeping with his helmet within arm's reach, claiming it comforted him to know he could arm himself quickly if danger arose. In truth, I suspect it was less about practical defense and more about the psychological need to remain, in some measure, a warrior even in rest. The armor itself did not simply vanish, it required care and attention. The squire arranged each piece carefully on a stand or in a chest, checking for damaged dents that needed hammering out, straps that required replacement, rust forming at the joints. In the morning, before the knight rose, these pieces would be oiled and polished, made ready for another day of use. The relationship between knight and armor was not unlike that between a farmer and his tools, or a scholar and his books. One depended upon the other, and neglect invited disaster. As the knight moved toward his bed, still adjusting to the strange lightness of his unarmored body, he represented the central paradox of his existence. By day, he was a weapon-trained, hardened, encased in steel. By night, he was simply a man seeking warmth and rest, no different in his basic needs from the poorest peasant. The removal of armor was the daily acknowledgement of this duality, a ritual that marked the boundary between the public role and the private self. I watched him pause at the bedside, running his hand along the curtain's fabric. His fingers, freed from gauntlets, could feel the texture of the weave, the slight dampness of condensation. He listened to the sounds of the castle settling into night-distant footsteps, the crack of a log in the fire, the moan of wind through stone corridors. These sounds reached him clearly now, without the muffling effect of a helmet. For a moment, he stood suspended between worlds, no longer the armored knight, but not yet the sleeping man. This liminal space, I have come to believe, was where knights were most truly themselves, not performing the role of warrior, not yet surrendered to unconsciousness, but simply present in their own bodies, feeling the ache of muscles and the pull of exhaustion. Then he climbed into the bed, and the next phase of the nightly ritual began. Chapter 5. The layering of defenses. The bed received him like a lover, enfolding him in prepared warmth. But even now, even with the servants' preparations and his own body heat beginning to accumulate within the curtained space, the knight was not finished with his defenses against the cold. For the greatest barrier between a man and death by freezing was not stone or fire or fur, but the layers he chose to wrap around his own flesh. I have always found it remarkable how medieval people understood, through pure observation and necessity, principles that your modern science would later codify. They knew that warmth was not a thing that could be added to the body, but rather a thing that must be prevented from escaping. And so they built barriers, textile fortresses, each layer adding to the resistance against heat loss. The knight had already shed his armor, but he was not naked. Few people of that era slept unclothed, particularly in winter. The base layer, touching the skin directly, was typically a linen shifta, simple tunic that fell to mid-thigh or knee. Linen was prized for its smoothness and its ability to wick moisture away from the skin. Sweat, even in a cold chamber, was the enemy of warmth. Damp fabric conducts heat away from the body far more efficiently than dry fabric. The linen shift served as a boundary layer, keeping the outer garments dry even as the body produced moisture through the night. Over the linen came wool. Wool, that miraculous fiber that had sustained humanity through countless winters, long before castles rose from the earth. Medieval wool was not like the soft merino or cashmere you might know today. It was coarser, heavier, retaining much of the lanolin, the natural oils from the sheep's fleece. This lanolin gave the wool a faint, earthy scent, somewhere between animal and oil, but it also provided water resistance and additional insulation. The knight might wear a wool tunic over his linen shift, and over that another layer, perhaps a heavier wool robe or a padded vest. On his legs, thick wool hose, perhaps 2 pairs, on the coldest nights. On his feet, wool socks, sometimes stuffed with dried grass or moss for additional insulation. But the layering did not stop with clothing. Once in bed, the knight pulled over himself the prepared blankets and furs. These were arranged in a specific order, each layer serving a distinct purpose. The linen sheet lay closest to his body, smooth and relatively easy to launder. Over this came wool blankets, typically 2, 3, or even 4 layers thick. These were heavy, often weighing as much as a small child, and they pressed down upon the sleeper with a reassuring weight. The science of this, though unknown to those who practiced it, was elegant. The weight of the blankets compressed the wool fibers slightly, reducing air circulation and creating countless tiny pockets of trapped air. Air is an excellent insulator when stationary. Moving air wind steals heat. Trapped air preserves it. The blankets created a still atmosphere, a dead zone where heat could accumulate. Finally came the pelts, the crowning layer of defense. I have described these before, but let me linger on them now, for they deserve our attention. A properly tanned pelt is a marvel of natural engineering. The hide provides a wind-proof barrier, while the fur creates a thick forest of fibers that trap air with remarkable efficiency. Different animals provided different qualities. Sheepskin was common and effective, its dense, curly wool creating excellent insulation. Bearskin was prized for its thickness and weight, capable of retaining warmth through even the longest nights. Wolf pelts carried a psychological elements, sleeping beneath the skin of a predator, dominating even in rest the wild things that prowled beyond the castle walls. The knight arranged these layers, now pulling them up to his chin. His breath, emerging as visible mist in the cold chamber, began to warm the space within the bed curtains. This was the final transformation, the creation of a microclimate, a tiny sphere of warmth carved out of the frozen night. But there was one more layer I have not yet mentioned, one that required no fabric or fur, shared warmth. The human body, at rest, produces heat roughly the same amount as a 100-watt light bulb. If you'll forgive the anachronistic comparison, one body can warm itself within layers of insulation. 2 bodies can warm each other far more effectively. It was not uncommon for knights to share their beds. A wife, if married, and the household permitted such proximity, provided not just companionship, but thermal mass. In winter campaigns, when sleeping in tents on frozen ground, knights might share blankets with their squires or fellow men-at-arms. There was no shame in this, no suggestion of impropriety. It was simple pragmatism. Survival trumped privacy. Animals, too, played their role in this calculus of warmth. A favorite hound might be permitted onto the bed, curling at the knight's feet or pressed against his back. The dog's higher body temperature and thick fur made it a living furnace, and the companionship it provided eased the long hours of darkness. I have heard of lords who preferred their dogs to their wives for bedmates, valuing the animal's unwavering loyalty and warmth without the complications of human relationship. On this particular night, our knight slept alone, or nearly so. His wife occupied her own chamber in another wing of the castle, a common arrangement among the nobility. But his hunting hound, a lean and scarred beast named Grendel, had followed him into the chamber, and now lay at the foot of the bed, just outside the curtains. The knight reached down and urged the dog closer, pulling it partially within the enclosed space. Grendel settled with a contented sigh, his warmth immediately noticeable. Within the curtained bed, the temperature began to rise, slowly, reluctantly, but measurably. The knight's breath no longer quite so visible. His fingers, which had been stiff with cold, began to relax. The multiple barriers, linen, wool, fur, fabric, breath, and dog were doing their work, but comfort remained relative. The cold had not been defeated. It had merely been held at bay. If the knight extended his hand beyond the curtains, he felt the bite of frigid air immediately. The chamber itself remained inhospitable. Only within this carefully constructed cocoon could warmth exist. I have often thought that this experience, this nightly retreat into layers, shaped the medieval consciousness in ways we can barely imagine now. To live in a world where warmth was never assumed, where cold was always pressing at the boundaries, waiting for defenses to fail. It created a particular relationship with winter, a respect bordering on fear, and a profound appreciation for the simple state of being warm. The knight adjusted the furs one final time, pulling them snug around his shoulders. His body had begun the slow descent toward sleep, that mysterious transition where consciousness loosens its grip and the mind wanders into dream. But even in sleep, he would remain partially vigilant, partially aware of the cold, ready to pull the covers tighter or adjust his position if drafts found their way through the defenses. This, then, was the art of winter sleep in a medieval castle, not a simple act of lying down and closing one's eyes, but a complex engineering problem solved through layering, planning, and constant adjustment. The knight had become, in effect, a curator of his own microclimate, managing the flow of heat with the precision of a military campaign. And outside the bed curtains, beyond the thick stone walls, winter continued its siege, patient, implacable, waiting for the slightest lapse in defense. Chapter 6: The Soundscape of Stone. Sleep, when it finally approached, did not arrive in silence. I want you to understand this, for it is perhaps one of the most striking differences between the rest you know and the rest experienced in a medieval castle. The night was never quiet. Instead, it was filled with a symphony of sounds, some comforting, others unsettling, all of them woven into the experience of sleep like threads in a tapestry. The knight, lying within his curtained cocoon, listened to the castle breathing around him. For truly, the fortress seemed alive in darkness, its stones and timbers producing a constant conversation of creaks, groans, and whispers. The most persistent sound was the wind. It found voice in every opening, every architectural gap. Through the arrow slits, those narrow windows, designed for defense, it whistled and moaned, creating notes that varied with its strength and direction. Sometimes it was a low bass rumble, like distant thunder. Other times it rose to a higher pitch, almost a shriek, as gusts caught the sharp edges of stone. The shutters over the windows rattled in their frames, wood knocking against wood with an irregular rhythm that could either lull or irritate, depending on the listener's state of mind. The fire in the fireplace contributed its own voice, the snap and crackle of burning logs, the occasional sharp pop as pockets of sap exploded in the heat, the softer, steady hiss of flames consuming wood. These sounds were among the most comforting in the chamber, for they represented warmth and light, humanity's oldest defenses against the dark. The rushes on the floor rustled when anything moved across them, sound like autumn leaves stirred by an unseen hand. If a servant passed in the corridor outside, the knight heard the distinctive crunch-crunch of footsteps. If a dog shifted position, there was a softer rustle, accompanied perhaps by the click of claws on stone where the rushes had been displaced. Water made itself known constantly. In the castle's fabric, moisture condensed, accumulated, and dripped. The knight might hear the steady plop-plop of water falling into a puddle. somewhere beyond his chamber, perhaps in a stairwell, perhaps from a leak in the roof above. On the coldest nights, this dripping slowed and eventually stopped as the water froze. But that brought its own sounds, the tick and crack of ice forming, the occasional sharp report as expanding ice split stone mortar. Human sounds reached the chamber as well, muffled by distance and walls, but never entirely absent. Somewhere in the castle, a baby cried thin and insistent, continuing until someone responded. In the great hall below, a few servants still moved about, their voices carrying upward in indistinct murmurs. If one listened carefully, one could discern laughter, though its source and cause remained mysterious. The guards on the walls added their own notes to the symphony. Their footsteps echoed hollowly on stone battlements, heavy regular, the sound of duty being performed through the long hours. Sometimes they stamped their feet against the cold, creating a brief thunder of boot heels. Sometimes they spoke to each other, brief exchanges, their words lost to distance, but their tone clear enough. Watchfulness, resignation, the camaraderie of shared misery. Animals contributed constantly. The horses in the stables below neighed and shuffled. Their hooves struck the stone or wooden floors with distinct rhythms. The knight could hear the rattle of chains as they shifted in their stalls, seeking more comfortable positions or simply moving to keep warm. The sound was oddly reassuring. These creatures, so vital to the knight's identity and mobility, were safe and near. Dogs barked occasionally, their cries sharp in the cold air. Sometimes it was a single bark, a challenge to some perceived threat. Other times it became a chorus as multiple hounds joined in, creating a wave of sound that rolled through the castle before subsiding. The knight had learned to distinguish between the tones. An alarm bark was sharp and aggressive. A bored bark was more perfunctory. The yipping and whining of dogs dreaming in their sleep was somehow the most endearing sound of all. Bells marked the passage of time with relentless precision. The chapel bell tolled for the canonical hours compline. As darkness settled, matins at midnight, lauds in the cold hours before dawn. Each sequence of strikes resonated through the stone, the sound waves traveling through walls and floors, making the very structure of the castle vibrate faintly. These bells were not merely timekeepers. They were reminders of the divine order that supposedly governed even the chaos of winter nights. I remember one particular castle where the bell tower stood close to the knight's quarters. The sound, when it struck, was so powerful that it seemed to shake the bedframe itself. The knight would jolt partially awake at each tolling, his body tensing reflexively before his mind caught up and recognized the familiar sound. Then he would settle back into his layers of wool and fur, waiting for his heartbeat to slow, for sleep to reclaim him. But the bells served another purpose beyond marking prayer times. A sudden, urgent ringing rapid clanging that broke the expected pattern could signal danger, fire, attack, some crisis that demanded immediate response. The knight, even in deepest sleep, maintained some part of his consciousness attuned to this possibility. His rest was never complete abandonment to unconsciousness. It was always conditional, always ready to transform into wakefulness and action. The sounds of the castle's structure itself formed a deep baseline beneath all these other noises. The timbers in the roof and floors expanded and contracted with temperature changes, producing groans and creaks that seemed almost vocal. A beam settling might sound like a sigh. A joist adjusting under load might crack like a breaking bone. These sounds could be startling to the uninitiated, but those who lived within the castle learned to read them like a language. One sound that particularly unnerved newcomers was the keening of the wind through the castle's defensive features. The machicolations, those projecting galleries with openings in the floor, designed to allow defenders to drop stones or boiling oil on attackers, acted as resonating chambers for the wind. It produced an eerie, almost human vocalization, a wordless lament that rose and fell with the gusts, combined with the natural human tendency to see patterns and intention in random phenomena. This created fertile ground for supernatural interpretation. Servants whispered of ghost spirits, of those who had died within the castle's walls, now condemned to wander the cold corridors for eternity. The lady in white who drifted through the solar, the headless knight who paced the battlements, the child who sobbed in empty chambers. These stories were repeated until they became part of the castle's identity. And on dark nights, when the wind howled and timbers groaned, even skeptical minds found themselves half believing. The knight, lying in his curtained bed, heard all of this: the wind, the fire, the dripping water, the guards, the animals, the bells, the groaning timbers, the distant voices. It was not chaotic exactly, but neither was it peaceful. It was simply the texture of night in a stone fortress, complex weaving of sounds that became, through familiarity, almost comforting. For what was more unsettling than noise was its absence. On rare occasions, perhaps, when a severe storm had passed, and the wind suddenly dropped, when the fires had burned low, and the household slept deeply, the castle would fall into an almost complete silence. This was when the night's unease grew. The silence felt unnatural, pregnant with threat. What danger lurked in that stillness? What attack was being prepared in that quiet? Noise meant life. It meant the guards remained vigilant, the fires still burned, the horses still lived, the household still breathed. Silence meant something had gone wrong, some vital function had failed. And so the knight actually took comfort in the cacophony, in the restless symphony of stone and wind and living things. As I watched him lying there, I could see his body gradually relaxing into the sounds, rather than fighting against them. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the wind's moaning. His heartbeat synchronized, perhaps unconsciously, with the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. He was becoming part of the castle's nighttime orchestra, adding his own small notes, the rustle of his movement beneath the furs, the soft whistle of breath through his nose, the occasional sigh or murmur as dreams began to form. And in this state, not quite awake, not quite asleep, he existed in a liminal space that was perhaps unique to the medieval experience of rest. Sleep was not an off switch, a clean transition from consciousness to unconsciousness. It was instead a gradual descent through layers of awareness, with the sounds of the castle accompanying him downward, never entirely leaving him, never allowing complete surrender. This was survival sleep, pragmatic sleep, the sleep of creatures who remain partially alert to danger even in rest. It was not the deep, restorative sleep that modern safety and silence allow. It was something more primal, more ancestral, the sleep of our distant forebears, who rested in caves while predators prowled outside, who could never afford to be entirely defenseless. The night wore on. The sounds continued their intricate dance, and the night drifted through shallow waters of sleep, rising occasionally toward wakefulness when some noise broke the established pattern, then sinking again when the disturbance proved benign. His body rested, yes, but remained coiled with potential, ready to spring into action if the soundscape shifted from ordinary to alarming. Outside, the guards completed their circuits. The horses settled into deeper rest. The wind found new voices in different corners of the fortress, and the castle, that great stone creature, breathed on through the darkness, carrying within its walls all the sleeping and waking souls who depended upon its protection. Chapter 7. The Vigil of Fire and Faith. As the night deepened and the cold pressed harder against the castle's defenses, two elements above all others sustained those who sheltered within: fire and faith. These were not separate concerns, but intertwined, each reinforcing the other, each providing a different form of warmth against the encroaching darkness. The fire in the knight's chamber had been carefully banked before he retired the servant, covering it with a layer of ash to slow its consumption while keeping the coals alive. But fire is a hungry, restless thing. It must be fed or it dies. And so, even as the household slept, servants moved through the castle on their rounds, tending the flames that kept death at bay. I have walked those rounds myself, in different ages, different castles. The fire watch was a position of immense responsibility and equally immense tedium. The servant assigned to this duty carried with him a bucket of water, a poker, and additional fuel. He moved from chamber to chamber, from hall to hearth, checking each fire in turn. The work required judgment. A fire burning too hot consumed fuel wastefully and risked sending sparks onto combustible surfaces, the rushes, the wooden furniture, the bed curtains. A fire burning too low failed in its primary purpose and would be difficult to revive come morning. The ideal fire glowed steadily, neither flaming nor smoking excessively, providing light and warmth without danger. But danger was always present. I cannot count the number of times I have seen castles burn magnificent structures, the work of decades, consumed in a single night because a spark leaped where it should not have gone. The combination of wood, fabric, and dry rushes created a tinderbox, a curtain brushed too close to a brazier, a log that rolled from the fireplace onto the floor, a sleeper who kicked off their covers and overturned a bedside candle. Fire was salvation and threat, warmth and destruction, held in impossible balance. The fire watch understood this. He moved quietly through the darkened castle, his presence marked only by the soft pad of footfalls and the occasional scrape of iron on stone as he adjusted logs or stirred coals. In a sense, he was as much a guard as those who paced the walls, defending not against human enemies, but against the treachery of the very element that sustained life. When he entered the knight's chamber, moving with practiced silence, so as not to disturb the sleeper, he paused to assess the fireplace. The flames had died to a dim glow, the logs reduced to pulsing embers. He added a fresh piece of wood, placing it carefully so that it would catch from the existing coals without smothering them. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then a tendril of smoke rose, followed by a small flame licking along the new wood's edge. The fire accepted the offering and gradually grew, casting renewed light across the stone walls. The servant also checked the brazier that had been placed near the bed. This required particular care, for braziers presented the greatest risk of fatal bad air. He examined it from a distance, watching for the color of the coals. A healthy red ringe was safe. A dull, grayish glow suggested insufficient oxygen, a sign of danger. Satisfied, he withdrew, pulling the door closed behind him with barely a sound. The night in his half-sleep, registered the servant's presence. On some level below, conscious thought, his body relaxed fractionally, reassured by the evidence of continued vigilance. The fire's renewed warmth reached him through the bed curtains, a gentle increase in temperature that eased muscles tensed against cold. But physical warmth alone could not fully comfort the medieval soul. For this, faith was required that other fire, invisible but no less vital. Before the knight had climbed into his bed, before he had pulled the curtains closed, he had knelt on the cold floor beside it. His hands, still stiff from the day's exertions, had pressed together in prayer. His lips had moved, forming words in Latin, the sacred language, the language of permanence and power. In manus tuas, Domini, he had whispered, into your hands, Lord, the prayer of commitment, of surrender. He was placing himself under divine protection for the hours of helplessness that lay ahead. The prayers varied depending on the knight's education and piety. Some recited full psalms from memory, their voices barely audible, the familiar words flowing like water over stones. Others managed only the simplest devotions, the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, but spoke them with deep sincerity. The content mattered less than the act itself. The ritual acknowledgement that survival through the night was not guaranteed, that forces beyond human control governed the darkness. I have observed that these prayers served multiple purposes. Yes, they were genuine appeals to the divine for protection, but they were also psychological preparation, a method of managing fear and anxiety. The act of prayer imposed structure on chaos, created a sense of agency in the face of helplessness. By reciting familiar words, by performing familiar gestures, the knight reasserted control over his interior world, even as the exterior world, cold, dark, unpredictable, pressed in from all sides. Some knights kept relics near their beds, fragments of saints' bones, splinters claimed to be from the true cross, vials of holy water, medallions blessed by bishops. These objects were tangible anchors for faith, things that could be touched and held when fear threatened to overwhelm. I knew one knight who kept a small wooden crucifix tucked beneath his pillow. In moments of wakefulness during the night, he would reach for it, his fingers finding the familiar shape in the darkness, and this physical contact would calm him enough to slip back towards sleep. The line between faith and superstition was, in truth, quite blurred. The medieval mind did not sharply distinguish between the religious and the magical. Prayers and charms existed on a continuum, both serving the same ultimate purpose, protection against the malevolent forces that stalked the night. For the night, in medieval understanding, was not merely dark, it was actively dangerous. Demons walked abroad after sunset. Evil spirits slipped through cracks in walls. Diseases rode on foul vapors that seeped from the earth. The dead might rise from their graves to trouble the living. These were not metaphors, but literal beliefs, as real to the medieval person as gravity is to you. The chamber, with its closed curtains and burning fires, became a sanctified space, a tiny island of holy protection in a sea of spiritual danger. The prayers, spoken before sleep, erected invisible walls, supplementing the physical walls of stone. The relic beneath the pillow was a talisman, radiating protective influence. Even the herbs, scattered among the rushes, rosemary, was particularly favored, carried both medicinal and spiritual significance, their strong scents believed to repel malevolent entities. And so the knight slept, or tried to sleep, wrapped in multiple layers of protection. the physical layers of fabric and fur, the architectural layers of curtain and stone, and the spiritual layers of prayer and faith. Each was necessary. Each contributed to the fragile sense of security that allowed the body to relax and consciousness to ebb. The chapel bell tolled matins midnight, the dead center of night, the hour when darkness pressed most heavily upon the world. The knight stirred at the sound, his eyes opening briefly. From his curtained enclosure, he could see nothing, but he heard the bell's resonance dying away into silence. He whispered a brief prayer habit, more than conscious devotion, and settled back into his furs. In the chapel itself, a handful of monks or priests would be rising from their own cold beds to perform the midnight office. Their voices would rise in plainchant Latin syllables, echoing in stone vaults, a human response to the inhuman silence of night. The knight was not required to join them. That level of devotion was for the religious, not for men of the sword, but he drew comfort from knowing the prayers were being said, that somewhere in the castle voices were raised against the darkness. This, too, was part of the complex ecology of survival. The division of labor extended beyond the practical and into the spiritual realm. While the guards protected the body against physical threats, while the fire watch protected against the danger of flame, the religious protected all souls through their constant intercession with the divine. Each person played their role, and together they formed a complete defense. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, the bell's echo faded completely. The knight's breathing deepened as he descended again toward the deeper waters of sleep. His hands, clasped loosely over his chest, still bore the impression of prayer fingers slightly curved, as though continuing to hold something invisible but precious. Outside the chamber, beyond the castle walls, the great forest stretched away into darkness leagues of timber and shadow, where wolves howled and unknown things moved between the trees. But the knight did not have to face that wilderness alone. He was protected by stone and fire, by vigilant servants and faithful prayers, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned how to carve out small spaces of safety in a dangerous world. And in that space, narrow though it was, temporary though it was, he rested. Not peacefully medieval sleep was seldom peaceful, but sustainably. He endured, he survived, and that, in the end, was the victory that mattered. Chapter 8. The Architecture of Dreams, Sleep. When it finally claimed the knight fully, did not transport him to some realm of pure rest and forgetfulness. Instead, his mind wandered through landscapes shaped by the very environment he was trying to escape, landscapes of cold and stone, of duty and danger, of memories and fears given physical form in the strange logic of dreams. I have always been fascinated by the dreams of those who lived in such harsh conditions. Your modern sleep, cushioned by comfort and safety, produces a different quality of dream than the sleep of one who rests with cold pressing at every boundary, who lies in armor's echo even hours after removing it, whose last waking thoughts were prayers for survival until dawn. The knight's dreams that night were vivid and fragmented, as dreams often are. He found himself standing on the battlements of his castle, but the stones beneath his feet were covered in ice-slick and treacherous. He wore no armor, only his linen shift, and the wind cut through the fabric as though it were nothing. Below, in the courtyard, figures moved, servants perhaps, or soldiers, but when he called out to them, his voice produced no sound. The silence was absolute, oppressive, more frightening than any noise. Then the scene shifted, as dreams do without transition or explanation. He was in a great hall, vaster than any hall he had known in waking life. A fire blazed at one end, enormous and roaring, but it provided no warmth. He walked toward it, his bare feet slapping on stone that felt like ice. And no matter how long he walked, the fire remained distant, unreachable. Other figures populated this hall nights he had known, some living, some long dead. They sat at long tables, eating and drinking, but they paid him no attention. He tried to speak to them, to ask where he was, but again his voice failed. He reached out to touch the shoulder of one knight, a friend from his youth, and his hand passed through the man as though he were made of smoke. Fear crept through the dream now, cold fear that matched the cold of the imagined hall. The knight turned and ran, seeking an exit, but every door he found opened onto winter scenes, snow-covered fields, frozen rivers, forests where the trees stood like black pillars against white ground. There was no escape from the cold, no refuge, no warmth anywhere in the entire world of the dream. These were not uncommon dreams for those who slept in medieval castles during winter. The constant physical sensation of cold, the daily struggle against it, seeped into the unconscious mind and shaped its nocturnal productions. Sleep researchers in your time have noted that external stimulant, temperature, sound, physical discomfort influence dream content. The knight's mind, even in sleep, registered the cold air touching his face, the weight of furs pressing down, the lingering ache in muscles compressed all day beneath armor. These sensations became the raw material from which dreams were constructed. But there were other dreams as well, shaped by different concerns. Sometimes the knight dreamed of battle, not the choreographed encounters of romance, but the chaotic, terrifying reality of actual combat. He swung his sword at enemies, who multiplied endlessly, who rose again each time they fell. His armor became impossibly heavy, dragging him down until he could barely move. Or worse, he found himself in battle completely unprotected, naked and vulnerable, while all around him armored men fought and died. These battle dreams carried the weight of memory. The knight had fought in campaigns in France, perhaps during one of the endless wars, or in skirmishes against raiders along the border. He had seen men die, had killed men himself. These experiences left marks on the psyche that sleep could not erase. The mind replayed them, examined them, tried to make sense of them, or perhaps simply could not let them go. There were also dreams of desire, for the dreams of medieval people were no less shaped by fundamental human urges than those of any other age. The knight might dream of his wife, if he had one, or of other women glimpsed at tournaments or feasts. But these dreams, too, were often tinged with the prevailing cold and discomfort. Even desire, even the warmth of imagined intimacy, could not fully banish the physical reality that pressed in from the waking world. And then there were the dreams that seemed to come from outside the self, the dreams that felt like visitations, like messages. The medieval person believed in the possibility of prophetic dreams, of visions sent by God or by saints. If a knight dreamed of a deceased father offering advice, this was not mere psychology, but potentially genuine communication across the boundary of death. If he dreamed of battles to come, this might be warning or prophecy. One particular type of dream was considered especially significant, the vision of judgment. The knight might dream of standing before God, his soul being weighed, his sins and virtues laid bare. In such dreams, the cold of the physical world transformed into the cold of spiritual dread. Had he lived righteously? Had he honored his oaths? Had he shown mercy to those beneath him, courage in the face of enemies, faith in moments of doubt? These judgment dreams could wake a man completely, his heart pounding, his body slick with sweat despite the cold. He would lie, rigid beneath his furs, staring into the darkness within the bed curtains, reviewing his life with the intensity of one who believes divine scrutiny is not metaphorical, but literal and imminent. Eventually, if he was fortunate, the fear would ebb, rationality would reassert itself, and he would sink back toward sleep. But the dream would linger, coloring his mood when morning came. I watched that night, as he passed through these various dreams, his body responding to his mental state. When the dreams were frightening, his breathing quickened, his hands clenched. When they were sad, his face took on an expression of grief that was almost unbearable to witness. When they were violent, his legs twitched as though running or fighting. The sleeping body is not still. It acts out its inner drama, constrained only by the paralysis that prevents most dreams from translating into full movement. At some point deep in the night's dreams shifted into what we might recognize as the segmented sleep pattern common in the medieval period. He rose slowly toward consciousness, not fully waking, but entering a twilight state between sleep and wakefulness. This was the watch, or first waking, a period that could last an hour or more, during which the mind was quiet but aware. In this state, the knight became conscious of his body again. He felt the press of the furs, the warmth of the dog at his feet, the cold air on his face. He heard the sounds of the castle fainter, now in the deepest part of night, but still present. He did not open his eyes or move significantly. He simply existed, floating in a peaceful space where thought was slow and undemanding. Some people used this time for prayer or meditation, others for practical concerns, adjusting, bedding, checking the fire, relieving themselves in the chamber pot. Still others for intimacy with a bed partner. These quiet hours offering privacy that the busy day did not allow. The knight simply rested, his mind drifting through gentle, aimless thoughts. He thought of his children's sons being raised to follow his profession, daughters who would be married to forge alliances. He worried about them vaguely, without the sharp edge that such worries carried in full daylight. He thought of spring, still months away, and the relief it would bring. He thought of very little, really, content to simply be warm and relatively comfortable in a world that so often offered neither. After perhaps an hour, he felt sleep approaching again, the second sleep that would carry him through until dawn. He welcomed it, letting his thoughts dissolve, his breathing deepen. The dreams would return, no doubt, but he had learned long ago not to fear them. They were simply part of the landscape of night, no more escapable than the cold or the stone walls. As he descended into deeper sleep once more, his mind produced a final image, a meadow in summer, sunlight warm on his face, the sound of bees among flowers. It was pure fantasy, bearing no relation to the frozen world outside his chamber, but it was sweet nonetheless. The mind's rebellion against winter, its insistence that warmth and softness still existed somewhere, even if only in dream. And so he slept on, through the darkest hours, through the final tolling of bells, through the gradual, almost imperceptible shift from night toward dawn. His dreams ebbed and flowed, rose and fell, carried him through regions of fear and comfort, memory and fantasy, judgment and grace. This was the interior journey that accompanied the exterior survival the mind's own struggle to endure, to make sense, to find meaning in the long darkness. The physical defenses kept the body alive. The dreams, in their strange way, kept the spirit alive, processing fear, rehearsing challenges, offering brief escapes, and ultimately affirming that even in the coldest, darkest night, something human persisted, something that cold and stone could not touch. Chapter 9. The ecology of the sleeping castle. While the knight dreamed within his curtained sanctuary, the castle around him hummed with its own nocturnal life, a complex ecosystem of humans, animals, and elemental forces, all interacting in patterns as intricate as any forest or sea. I want you to understand that a castle was never simply a building. It was more like an organism, a living thing composed of many parts that depended upon each other for survival. And nowhere was this more apparent than during the deep hours of night, when the formal hierarchy of daylight dissolved into something more fluid and essential. In the stables below the knight's chamber, the horses stood in their stalls, their bodies radiating heat into the cold air. These were not merely animals, but valuable assets, war horses, worth more than many human lives, trained for years, capable of carrying an armored man into battle. They required constant care, and even at night, grooms slept nearby on straw pallets, ready to respond if a horse took sick or became agitated. The warmth generated by these large animals was not incidental. In the cruel mathematics of medieval survival, every source of heat mattered. Some castles were deliberately designed with stables beneath or adjacent to living quarters, allowing the warmth from animal bodies to rise through floors or seep through shared walls. The smell was powerful manure, hay, leather, the musky scent of horses themselves, but for those who lived with it constantly, it became simply the smell of life, even of comfort. I remember one castle where the knight insisted his favorite destrier be stabled directly below his chamber. He claimed he slept better hearing the horse breathing and moving below, that the presence of this creature he trusted with his life in battle comforted him in the vulnerability of sleep. Whether the warmth rising through the floorboards or the psychological reassurance mattered more, I could not say. Perhaps both were equally necessary. The dogs, too, played their role in the castle's nocturnal ecosystem. Most castles maintained packs of hunting hounds, greyhounds, Limer Houndsage breed, serving specific purposes. These dogs did not kennel outside in winter, but were brought into the great hall or into the lower rooms, where they provided both security and warmth. They were alert to unusual sounds, quick to bark at anything that disturbed the night's routine. In this sense, they were an early warning system, supplementing the human guards on the walls. Some dogs enjoyed special privileges, allowed to sleep in their master's chambers, or even in their beds. I have mentioned the knight's hound, Grendel, curled at the foot of the bed. Such arrangements were common enough that no one thought them strange. The dog offered warmth, yes, but also psychological comforta, living presence in the darkness. A creature that would wake and alert at danger, whose simple existence made the night less lonely. Of course, dogs brought their own challenges. They harbored fleas and ticks, parasites that transferred readily to human hosts. They scratched and shook themselves at inconvenient moments, disturbing rest. They sometimes growled or barked at dream phantoms, startling everyone awake. But these irritations were accepted as the price of their benefits. Cats moved through the castle like shadows, unseen but essential. Unlike dogs, they rarely attached themselves to individual humans. but they served the crucial function of controlling rodent populations. A castle without cats was a castle overrun with mice and rat screechers that consumed stored grain, gnawed through wooden beams and leather goods, spread disease, and generally made life miserable. The cats haunted the storerooms, the kitchens, the stables, anywhere food might be found or where mice might nest. They were largely nocturnal, and so while the human and canine inhabitants slept, the cats conducted their silent war against the rodents. A good mouser was valued, though seldom loved, in the way dogs were. Cats were utilitarian creatures, tolerated rather than embraced, though I suspect some lonely servants or children found comfort in their presence. Birds, too, were sometimes kept within the castle during winter. Falcons and hawks, the prized hunting birds of the nobility, could not be left to freeze in outdoor mews. They were brought inside, hooded and perched on wooden stands, sometimes in the same chambers where their owners slept. The knight I have been describing kept no falcon in his chamber, but in other rooms of the castle, these raptors sat motionless on their perches, their sharp eyes hidden by leather hoods, their presence adding another layer of strangeness to the castle's night. The human inhabitants formed their own ecological layers, stratified by rank and function. At the top, nobles like our knight slept in relative privacy and comfort, attended by servants who had themselves retreated to dormitories or smaller chambers. These servants' pages, squires, chambermaids, slept in shared spaces, huddled together for warmth, their accommodations far more Spartan than those of their masters. In the great hall, the lowest tier of servants might still be sleeping on benches or the floor near the central hearth, wrapped in their cloaks, using their arms or bundles of cloth as pillows. For them, the concept of going to bed was almost meaningless. They simply found a spot, curled up, and hoped for a few hours of rest before dawn demanded their labor again. The guards on the walls represented a different category, entirely those who remained awake so others could sleep. Their vigil was enforced by rotation. They served shifts of several hours before being relieved, but their work was brutally taxing. Exposed to the full fury of winter on the open battlements, they walked their prescribed routes, peered out into darkness, listened for any sound that might signal danger. These men fought their own battle against the cold, employing whatever strategies they could devise. They walked briskly to keep blood circulating. They stamped their feet, clapped their hands. They huddled briefly in whatever sheltered corners the architecture provided doorways, recesses, the spaces behind crenellations. Some carried small personal braziers, though these were discouraged because they ruined night vision and presented fire hazards. The relief they felt when their shift ended and they could descend to warmer spaces below was profound. But often their quarters were not much warmer than the walls they had just left, and they would crawl into shared beds, their bodies still shaking with cold, waking the men who would take the next shift. I have stood watch with such men in various centuries, and the experience was always the same, a test of endurance that stripped away everything inessential. Cold, fatigue, and monotony reduced consciousness to its most basic elements. You existed in an eternal present, each moment stretching out, time losing its normal flow. The only thoughts that arose were simple ones. How much longer until relief? Is that sound dangerous? Will I ever be warm again? And yet there was also a strange beauty In it the stars brilliantly clear, in the frozen air the moon casting silver light across snow-covered fields, the absolute silence of a winter night, broken only by wind and the distant howl of wolves. In those moments, one felt connected to something larger, to all the watchmen who had ever stood on walls, guarding the sleeping, holding back the dark. The castle's metabolism slowed during night, but never stopped entirely. In the kitchens, fires were banked, but never fully extinguished. In the brewery, fermentation continued at its own pace, the yeast working, regardless of human sleep. In the chapel, the eternal flame before the altar burned steadily, tended by monks or priests who themselves maintained a vigil of prayer. This nocturnal ecology was fragile, maintained through constant effort and attention. The failure of any component could cascade into disaster. If the fire watch fell asleep and a blaze started, the entire castle could burn. If the guards on the walls failed to notice raiders, the household could be slaughtered. If the stables were neglected and horses took sick, the knight's military effectiveness was crippled. Everything depended on everything else. A web of interdependencies that only became fully visible when traced through the hours of night. The night's peaceful sleep-hour, relatively peaceful, given the constant intrusions of cold and discomfort rested upon this foundation of vigilance and labor. He was not alone in his struggle against winter, even though he slept in solitary state behind curtains. He was supported by dozens of other souls, each playing their part, each enduring their own version of the long night. And beyond the castle walls, the natural world pursued its own patterns. Wolves hunted in packs, their howls carrying across frozen fields. Owls flew on silent wings, seeking mice and voles. Deer huddled in the shelter of forests, conserving energy, surviving. The winter night was not empty, but full of life, full of struggle, full of the eternal contest between survival and extinction. All of this human, animal, elemental wove together into a complex whole. The castle was a node of order and warmth in a landscape of cold and chaos, but that order required endless maintenance, and warmth was never guaranteed. It had to be created and defended, moment by moment, night after night, through the long months until spring. The night, dreaming behind his curtains, was both separate from this ecology and part of it. His body heat contributed fractionally to warming the chamber. His dog's body heat contributed more. The fire's heat was the gift of a servant's labor and a forest's sacrifice. The prayers whispered in the chapel offered spiritual warmth, if such a thing exists. The guards on the wall provided security, without which no sleep would be possible. It was all connected, a vast, intricate mechanism for survival, humming along through the darkness. And when dawn finally came, when the household began to stir and resume its daylight activities, this nocturnal architecture would fade from view, become invisible again. But it would return the next night, and the next, and the next, as reliable as sunset, as necessary as breath. Chapter 10. The Alchemy of Morning. Dawn arrived not as a sudden illumination, but as a gradual theft of darkness, subtle at first, then undeniable. The night, deep in his second sleep, became dimly aware of change before his conscious mind could name it. The quality of darkness behind his closed eyelids shifted from absolute to merely deep. The sounds of the castle transformed, the echoing stillness of night giving way to the earliest stirrings of activity. In the great hall below, the first servants were already moving. A young page stumbled from his sleeping spot near the hearth, his body stiff with cold despite his proximity to the dying embers. His task was to revive the fire, to clear away ash, add kindling and wood, coax the coals back into flame. He worked quickly, his breath clouding in the frigid air, his fingers clumsy with sleep and cold. Similar scenes unfolded throughout the castle. In the kitchen, cooks began the day's labor, lighting ovens, setting water to boil. In the stables, grooms stirred, coughing and stretching, before beginning the work of feeding and watering the horses. In the chapel, those religious who maintained the rhythm of prayer gathered for lauds. The night stirred, rising slowly through layers of consciousness. He was aware, first, of cold, his face exposed outside the bed. Curtains had grown quite numb during the night. Then of discomfort, his body ached from lying in roughly the same position for hours, from the weight of furs pressing down, from the residual tension that never fully left muscles, even in sleep. He opened his eyes to darkness. Within the curtained enclosure, no light penetrated. He could see nothing, though he could hear the dog's steady breathing, the crackle of the fire that someone must have already tended, distant voices and footsteps. He lay still for a moment longer, reluctant to leave the relative warmth of the bed, knowing that the act of emerging would plunge him back into cold's embrace. This moment of hesitation is one I have witnessed countless times across the centuries. The medieval morning required courage of a sort that is difficult to explain to those who have never known true cold. It was not merely uncomfortable to rise from bed, it was actively painful. Every nerve in the body recoiled from the prospect. The warmth accumulated through hours of effort would be lost in seconds, and yet rise one must. Duty, necessity, and the rhythms of the household allowed no alternative. The knight drew a deep breath, the air sharp in his lungs, and pushed back the curtains. The shock was immediate and total. Cold rushed in like water into a breached hull, flooding the warm space he had so carefully maintained. He swung his legs out from beneath the furs, his feet finding the floor stone even colder than the air, drawing heat from his soles like a vampire draws blood. He stood quickly, the dog stirring and stretching at his movement. For a moment he simply endured, his body shaking involuntarily, breath coming in rapid gasps. This was the price of survival. This daily resurrection into cold, this forced abandonment of the only comfortable space in the entire fortress. The chamber was dim, but no longer dark. Gray light seeped through the cracks around the window shutters, revealing the room in colorless detail. He could see his breath, thick clouds that hung briefly before dissipating. He could see frost-delicate patterns tracing the inside of the shutters, clinging to the stone walls in the corners farthest from the fire. The fire itself had been recently tended. Someone had entered while he slept, adding fresh wood. It burned modestly now, enough to provide some light and take the worst edge off the cold, but far from the roaring blaze that would have been required to truly warm the space. Fuel economy remained a constant concern. The household could not afford to be profligate with wood, no matter how wealthy the lord. The knight moved toward the fire, drawn like all living things to its promise of warmth. He stood before it, turning slowly, trying to heat all sides of his body, equilia futile effort, as the parts facing away from the flames immediately lost whatever warmth they had gained. Still, he persisted, performing this ancient dance, as humans had done for millennia before castles even existed. A knock came at the door, soft but distinct. "Enter," he called, his voice rough with sleep and cold. The door opened, admitting his squire boy, of perhaps 14, red-nosed and shivering despite the heavy cloak wrapped around him. "My lord," he said, bowing slightly, "dawn is near. Shall I prepare your armor?" The knight nodded, and the squire set to work. This was the reverse of the previous night's ritual, the transformation of man back into warrior. But first came more immediate needs. From beneath the bed, the squire retrieved the chamber pot. Medieval delicacy did not permit detailed discussion of bodily functions, but they were nonetheless unavoidable facts of life. The knight used the vessel while the squire discreetly busied himself with laying out clothes and checking the armor for any overnight condensation that might have caused rust. The process of dressing was another layer by a ritual. The knight had slept in his linen under the tunic. This he kept on. Over it went a fresh wool tunic, then hose pulled up and tied. His boots, which had been placed near the fire to keep them from freezing solid, were stiff but manageable. He worked his feet into them, the leather cold against his skin despite the fire's proximity. Only then came the armor. The squire helped him into the gambeson, first that quilted padding essential for preventing the mail from chafing. Then the mail shirt lifted over his head, settling onto his shoulders with its familiar weight. The sensation was strange after a night of freedom, like being imprisoned again. Like accepting a burden he had briefly been allowed to set down. Piece by piece, the armor returned to his body. The breastplate buckled across his chest, the pauldrons protecting his shoulders, the vambraces on his forearms. Each addition made him more formidable, more protected, but also more constrained. By the time the squire finished, the knight had been transformed. The vulnerable man who had shivered before the fire was gone, replaced by a figure of iron and authority. But before leaving the chamber, the knight paused at a small wooden stand near the door. Upon it sat a basin of water ice cold, with a skim of ice forming at its edges. He broke the ice with his fingers, wincing at the cold, then splashed water on his face. The shock was intense, driving away the last remnants of sleep, making his skin burn and tingle. A small square of linen served as a towel. He dried his face, then crossed himself, lips moving in a brief morning prayer. Thanks for survival through the night. A plea for protection through the coming day. The same ritual performed by countless others throughout the castle and beyond its walls. A collective acknowledgement that life was precarious and required divine assistance. "Come," he said to the squire, "the day awaits." They left the chamber, stepping into the corridor beyond. The cold here was worse, no fire to mitigate it, just stone and air that felt thick with chill. Their breath preceded them in clouds as they walked toward the great hall where the household would gather for the morning meal. Along the way, they passed others engaged in their own morning rituals. Servants hurried past, carrying water, wood, food. A knight from another chamber emerged, similarly armored, and nodded in greeting. A page rushed by with a bundle of linens, destined for some chamber or another. The castle was awakening fully now, its population stirring, beginning the complex choreography of another day. In the great hall, the transformation was dramatic. The space that had been dim and echoing during the night now buzzed with activity. The fire had been built up into a proper blaze, and people clustered near it, seeking warmth. Trestle tables were being set up, benches positioned. The smell of food, fresh bread, porridge, salted meat filled the air, mixing with wood smoke and the general mustiness of the hall. The knight took his place at the high table, his rank affording him both position and privilege. A servant brought him ale and bread. The first meal of the day was simple, but necessary. He ate mechanically, his body still adjusting to wakefulness, his mind beginning to turn toward the day's duties. As he ate, he reflected, though perhaps not consciously, on the night that had passed. He had survived it, as he had survived countless others. The cold had not claimed him. The darkness had not kept him. The complex machinery of castle life servants, fires, prayers, vigilance had carried him through one more cycle from dusk to dawn. But already, even as weak winter sunlight began to filter through the high windows of the great hall, he knew that tonight would bring the same struggle. The cold would return with sunset, as inexorable as the turning of the spheres. The chamber would need to be prepared again, the fires lit, the bed warmed, the armor would be removed, the prayers spoken, the curtains drawn. The long battle against winter would resume, as it did every night, as it would continue to do until spring finally released its grip on the land. This was the rhythm of medieval winter, not a single ordeal to be endured and overcome, but a repeating cycle, a test that renewed itself daily. Survival was not a destination, but a practice, something achieved through constant effort and attention. There were no guarantees, no permanent victories. One simply persisted, day after day, night after night, through the dark months until the world tilted once more toward warmth. I watched him there, this night, whose night I have traced in such detail, and I felt a familiar mixture of admiration and sorrow. Admiration for the sheer tenacity required to live this way, for the stubborn refusal to surrender to cold and darkness. Sorrow for the hardness of that life, for the constant discomfort that was simply accepted as the price of existence. But I also felt something else, a recognition that in their struggle against winter, these medieval people were engaged in something deeply human and even noble. They were not passive victims of circumstance, but active agents, deploying intelligence and cooperation to create spaces of warmth and safety in a hostile world. Every fire lit, every curtain drawn, every prayer spoken was an act of defiance, a declaration that human will and ingenuity could carve out survival, even in the harshest conditions. The knight finished his meal and stood, ready to face whatever duties the day demanded: training in the yard, perhaps, or consultation with the steward about household matters, or preparations for a journey. The night was behind him now, temporarily forgotten in the press of daylight concerns. But it would return. Night always returned. And when it did, the castle would once again transform into that complex ecology of survival I have described: fires burning, guards walking, prayers rising, bodies seeking warmth, minds seeking rest. The great stone fortress would become a vessel carrying its human cargo through darkness toward another dawn. And in chambers throughout the castle, knights and nobles and servants would lie beneath their furs, wrapped in their lairs, listening to the wind and the bells, dreaming their dreams, enduring their cold, surviving their night. This was how they lived. This was how they persisted. This was the answer to the question of how medieval people slept in castles during winter. Not comfortably, not easily, but stubbornly, collectively, through a combination of practical measures and psychological resilience that allowed them to face each night and each morning with the courage necessary to continue. Chapter 11. The Weight of Winter's Memory. As the days wore on and winter deepened its grip, the nightly routine I have described became not merely familiar, but almost automatic, a ritual so ingrained that it required little conscious thought. Yet beneath this surface of routine, something else accumulated: memory, both personal and collective, of what winter demanded and what winter taught. I have noticed, across the many centuries I have witnessed, that those who endured harsh winters developed a particular relationship with time. Winter was not simply a season to be survived, but a crucible that shaped character and worldview. The knight who emerged from winter into spring was not the same man who had entered it. Something had been burned away, something else tempered and strengthened. The cumulative exhaustion of poor sleep, of constant cold, of the daily effort required simply to maintain basic comfort, this wore on the body and the spirit. I remember one particularly brutal winter in a castle on the northern marches, where the cold persisted unbroken for 4 months. No thaw came, no respite. The world remained locked in ice, the sun weak and distant, the nights impossibly long. By the end of that winter, the knight whose chamber I had observed, let us call him Sir Godric, for he deserves a name, had aged visibly. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His movements had become stiffer, more cautious. He complained of pains in his joints that had not troubled him before. The accumulated toll of hundreds of cold nights had ridden itself into his flesh. But there was also something else in his bearing a quiet pride, a sense of having endured a test and emerged intact. When spring finally arrived and warmth returned to the land, the relief was profound. But so too was the awareness of capability, of having faced winter and survived. This was a victory of sorts, perhaps not celebrated with feasts or songs, but meaningful nonetheless. The castle itself bore the marks of winter's passage. Wood that had been dry in autumn was now warped with moisture. Stone that had been sound showed new cracks where water had seeped in and frozen, expanding, breaking bonds that had held for decades. The wear was cumulative, barely noticeable year to year, but significant over time. Castles aged as humans aged under winter's assault. Yet there was also a kind of beauty in this seasonal struggler, beauty I have grown to appreciate over my long existence. The castle in winter, with frost tracing its stones and smoke rising from its chimneys into crystalline air, became something more than a military structure. It became a symbol of human persistence, of the refusal to surrender to nature's indifference. I think often of the servants who made noble sleep possible, those invisible laborers whose own rest was sacrificed so that others might find comfort. They slept, if they slept at all, on hard surfaces, in cold corners, wrapped in inadequate garments. They rose before dawn to light fires. They worked through the day, and they maintained vigil through the night. Their names are lost to history, their individual stories forgotten, but their labor was the foundation upon which the entire structure of medieval life rested. Without them, the nights would have frozen. Without them, the fires would have died. The chambers would have been unprepared. The complex machinery of survival would have failed. They were as essential as the stone walls themselves, and far more vulnerable. Their sacrifice for that is what it was, even if not freely chosen, deserves acknowledgement. There is a particular injustice in how survival was distributed in medieval society. Those who bore the heaviest burdens enjoyed the least comfort. Those who commanded the most resources contributed the least labor. Sir Godric slept beneath furs in a curtained bed, while the boy who warmed that bed shivered on a pallet in a drafty corridor. This inequality was not seen as unjust by most who lived within it. It was simply the natural order, ordained by God and confirmed by tradition. And yet, I have also witnessed moments that troubled this neat hierarchy. A knight who invited a freezing servant to warm himself briefly by the fire. a lady who distributed her old furs to the household staff, a lord who ensured that even the lowest servants received adequate food during the lean winter months. These were small mercies, perhaps, but they suggested that even within rigid social structures, compassion could find expression. The question of how knights slept in medieval castles is, at its heart, a question about how human beings create survival in hostile conditions. And the answer is complex, involving technology, such as it was, social organization, psychological resilience, and a willingness to accept discomfort that would be intolerable to most modern sensibilities. But it is also a question about inequality and privilege. The knight's sleep was purchased at the cost of others' labor and sacrifice. His comfort, relative though it was, depended on a system that extracted effort from those with no choice but to give it. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but it would be dishonest to tell the story of medieval sleep without recognizing this truth. As winter slowly released its grip and the first hints of spring appeared, a day, slightly warmer, a morning when frost did not coat the shutters, the distant call of birds returning from their southern migrations, the castle's inhabitants emerged like survivors of a siege. They had held out, they had endured, and now relief was approaching. Sir Godric, standing on the battlements one early spring morning, looked out over lands beginning to thaw and felt something loosen in his chest. Attention he had carried so long he had ceased to notice it. The winter was ending. He had survived another one. There would be others. He knew winters stretched ahead as far as he could imagine, each one a test to be faced. But for now, this winter was done. In the nights that followed, as temperatures slowly climbed, sleep became easier. The fires could be smaller, the layers fewer. The bed curtains could be left partially open without inviting disaster. The soundscape of the castle changed: less wind, less creaking of frozen timbers, more of the softer sounds of spring, rain instead of sleet, birdsong at dawn, the distant bleating of lambs born in the warming weather. But the memory of winter remained. It always remained. And when the next autumn came and the cold began its inexorable return, that memory would shape the preparations. Fires would be laid earlier, furs brought out sooner. The nightly rituals resumed with the weary familiarity of soldiers returning to a familiar battlefield. This was the cycle: cold and warmth, struggle and relief, winter and spring, darkness and light. Human life in the medieval world was inseparable from these natural rhythms. There was no escape from them, no technology adequate to fully insulate people from the turning of the seasons. One lived within nature's constraints, adapted to them, and found ways to endure. And in enduring, one discovered things about oneself and about human nature generally. One learned patience, for winter could not be rushed. One learned cooperation, for survival required collective effort. One learned to appreciate small comforts: warm fire, a dry bed, a full stomach, precisely because they were neither guaranteed nor permanent. The medieval person developed what we might call a tragic sensibility and awareness that life was hard, that suffering was inevitable, that death was always close. But this was not a despairing worldview. Rather, it was realistic, and within that realism was space for joy, for gratitude, for moments of grace that shone all the brighter against the background of difficulty. Sir Godric, lying in his bed on one of the final cold nights of that long winter, felt something he could not quite name. It was not happiness. His body still ached. The cold still pressed at the curtains. Morning would bring new duties and challenges. but it was perhaps contentment of a sort, the quiet satisfaction of having endured, of having played his role in the great human drama of survival, of being alive in a world that constantly tested whether one deserved to remain so. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him, knowing that in the darkness beyond his chamber, guards still walked the walls, fires still burned, prayers still rose, and the castle still maintained its vigil against the night. He was part of something larger than himself, a web of mutual dependence that bound lord and servant, human and animal, present and past. And in that connection, fragile though it was, temporary though it was, he found what warmth truly meant. Not simply heat for the body, but belonging. Not simply survival, but meaning. Not simply endurance, but dignity in the face of hardship. This, I believe, is what the medieval experience of winter sleep can teach us across the centuries. That comfort is not necessary for rest, that hardship can be borne with grace, and that the human capacity for adaptation and persistence is far greater than we imagine in our softened age. The cold came every year, the darkness returned every night, but so too did dawn and spring, and the enduring human refusal to surrender to forces that seemed overwhelming. That refusal, more than any technology or resource, was what allowed knights to sleep in medieval castles during the coldest nights. They slept as humans have always slept, in harsh conditions, poorly perhaps, but with determination. Uncomfortably, yes, but with hope. And they woke, morning after morning, ready to face another day, another night, another winter. That is the essence of survival, and it is a lesson as relevant now as it was in those distant, frozen centuries. Chapter 12. The Echo That Remains. And so we come to the end of this particular memory. This journey through one winter night in a medieval castle. But before I release you back to your own warm beds and safe dwellings, let me offer a final reflection on what this history means, what it tells us about the people who lived it, and about ourselves. The medieval world is often romanticized in your age. It appears in stories as a time of knights and ladies, of chivalry and adventure, of castles gleaming in sunlight. These images are not entirely false. Such moments existed, and they carried their own truth. But they were moments only, brief points of light in a much darker, colder, more difficult existence. The reality of medieval life, particularly in winter, was one of constant negotiation with discomfort. Every comfort achieved was temporary. Every warmth created was fragile. Every night of rest required hours of preparation and vigilance. Nothing was easy, nothing was given, nothing could be taken for granted. And yet people lived fully within these constraints. They loved, they laughed, they dreamed, they created beauty, they built civilizations that endured for centuries. The harshness of their material conditions did not diminish their humanity of anything. It sharpened it, made it more vivid and more precious. When I think of Sir Godric and the countless others like him, what strikes me most is not their suffering, but their resilience. They did not expect life to be comfortable. They did not feel entitled to warmth or ease or good sleep. They simply worked with what they had, adapted to circumstances, and found ways to survive. That blended practical skill with psychological fortitude. There is something instructive in this for your age, I think. You live in a world of unprecedented comfort, where warmth is summoned at the touch of a button, where food is abundant, where shelter from the elements is nearly universal in the developed world. These are magnificent achievements, and I do not mean to diminish them. But I wonder sometimes if something has been lost in the process, some quality of appreciation, some depth of gratitude, some understanding of what survival actually requires. When warmth is effortless, do we value it as deeply as those who fought for every degree of heat? When comfort is constant, do we recognize it as the miracle it truly is? The medieval person knew cold intimately. They felt it in their bones, in their joints, in the perpetual ache that accompanied winter. But they also knew, warmth truly knew it, in a way that perhaps you cannot. They knew the exquisite relief of approaching a fire after hours in the cold. They knew the profound luxury of climbing into a bed that had been carefully warmed. They knew the gift of a clear morning after a night survived. These experiences have not disappeared from the world, of course. There are still places where people struggle against cold, where survival is a daily negotiation, where comfort must be created rather than simply purchased. But in much of your world, these realities have receded from everyday consciousness. Winter is an inconvenience, not a crucible. Cold is a brief discomfort between heated spaces, not a constant companion. I do not say this to criticize or to suggest that suffering builds character that would be both untrue and cruel. Suffering is simply suffering, and its elimination is a worthy goal. But I do think something is gained by remembering how it once was, by connecting across the centuries to those who lived under harsher conditions and nevertheless persisted. When you pull your blankets close tonight, when you adjust your thermostat, when you lie in your comfortable bed in your warm room, perhaps spare a thought for Sir Gotrek and his kind. Remember the servants who warmed his bed, the guards who walked frozen battlements, the fire watch who tended flames through the long hours. Remember the complex ecology of survival that made rest possible in a world that offered no easy comfort. And perhaps, in remembering, you might feel a deeper appreciation for what you have, not just material comforts, but the long arc of human progress that brought them into being. Every warm room is a victory over the cold that once claimed so many lives. Every comfortable night is a triumph of human ingenuity and cooperation. Every morning you wake refreshed is a gift that countless generations worked toward but never received. The medieval castle stands now, in your age, as a ruin or a museum, its stones still cold, its halls still echoing, but empty of the life that once filled them. The fires are long dead, the beds are gone. The people who struggled and survived within those walls are dust, their names mostly forgotten. But their experience persists as memory, as history, as a reminder of what human beings can endure and achieve. They faced impossible odds cold that could kill, darkness that harbored genuine dangers, a world indifferent or hostile to their survival, and they prevailed, not through any miracle or magic, but through cooperation, ingenuity, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. This is the legacy they left us, not just the physical castles, beautiful though they are, but the demonstration of human resilience. They showed that even in the coldest night, even in the darkest hour, even when comfort seems impossible, survival is achievable. Not easy, not comfortable, but possible. And in that possibility lies hope that whatever challenges we face, whatever winters descend upon us, we too possess the strength to endure. We are their descendants, carrying their genes, their patterns of thought, their capacity for adaptation. The same blood that kept them warm beneath insufficient furs flows in our veins. The same minds that figured out how to survive in stone refrigerators live on in us. So, as you drift toward sleep tonight, comfortable and warm, remember them with gratitude. Remember that your comfort was built on their hardship, that your ease emerged from their struggle, that your warm bed connects backward through time to a young page shivering on a pallet, a servant warming sheets with a coal-filled pan, a knight praying for survival through one more cold night. We are all connected past and present, comfortable and struggling, knight and servant, remembered and forgotten. We are all part of the same long human story, the same enduring effort to create spaces of warmth and safety in a world that does not automatically provide them. The castle stands empty now, but the lessons it teaches remain vital. That survival requires effort, that comfort must be created, that hardship can be borne, and that the human capacity for adaptation and persistence is perhaps our species' greatest strength. Sleep well, my dear listener. Sleep warm and safe. And remember, as you drift into your dreams, those who came before, who slept poorly, but with determination, uncomfortably but with hope, and who woke, morning after morning, to face another day. They endured, we endure. And in that continuity of endurance lies something worth remembering, something worth honoring, something that connects us across the centuries to all who have struggled and survived, and passed their strength on to the next generation. And thus ends another memory from ages long past. If you have found a spark of wonder here, stay a while longer, for there are countless tales yet to be remembered.